In the City of London, history lives in every brick and every street corner. Palaces stand beside modern glass towers. Medieval churches look down on highways. And monuments of empire echo the legacy of Britain's role in shaping the world. Yet in the middle of this city, where time feels heavy and institutions project stability, an unexpected storm began to rise. It was not a storm of weather, nor a storm of war, but a political tempest that blended diplomacy, espionage, and the struggle for power. At the very center of this storm lay a single piece of land once home to the Royal Mint in Tower Hamlets, now transformed into the focus of one of the most controversial diplomatic battles in modern British history. The plan seemed simple at first glance. China, a nation whose influence had expanded across every continent, announced its intention to build a new embassy in London. But not just any embassy. It would be the largest Chinese embassy in Europe, a sprawling compound that combined consular services, cultural spaces, and advanced facilities to project Beijing's presence in the very heart of the United Kingdom. To China, this was a practical step forward, an embassy big enough to reflect its global rise. To Britain, however, it was something else entirely. The idea of hosting a fortress-like Chinese complex just a short walk away from some of the most sensitive institutions in the country set alarm bells ringing across intelligence agencies, political offices, and even neighborhood associations. On the surface, embassies are supposed to be centers of diplomacy, bridges between nations, places where dialogue replaces confrontation. Yet anyone who understands the shadowy world of international politics knows that embassies are more than that. They are also instruments of power, symbols of presence, and, at times, hubs of espionage. During the Cold War, the story was well known. Embassies housed intelligence officers disguised as diplomats. Rooms were filled with hidden listening devices, and cables ran underground to intercept communication lines. The collapse of the Berlin Wall may have ended that era, but the tactics did not vanish. They evolved. Today, embassies are equipped with cyber tools, advanced cameras, and encrypted systems capable of launching or defending against digital attacks. That is why the Royal Mint site raised such suspicion. The land itself was no ordinary patch of property. Located close to the Bank of England, the London Stock Exchange, and within reach of Whitehall's government departments, it offered what security experts would call a vantage point. In simpler words, it was the perfect location for surveillance. To Britain's security services, the construction of a vast embassy there was less about bricks and mortar and more about access to observe, to monitor, and perhaps to influence. As the news spread, the whispers began. Could this embassy be used to spy on Britain from within its own capital? Could the underground structures and the architectural plans house secure data centers for intelligence gathering? Were the reinforced buildings simply for protection? Or were they fortifications designed to shield high-tech operations? The questions multiplied, and with them, the unease. This unease was magnified by the broader context of UK-China relations. Over the past decade, the relationship had shifted dramatically. What was once described as a golden era of cooperation had deteriorated into one of mistrust and confrontation. Britain had condemned China's tightening grip over Hong Kong, clashed with Beijing over human rights abuses in Xinjiang, and banned the Chinese company Huawei from building its 5G infrastructure, citing national security concerns. Each of these episodes left scars. Each added to the atmosphere of suspicion. And so, when the embassy plans surfaced, many saw it not as a neutral construction project, but as the latest chapter in an unfolding rivalry. But while national security experts worried about espionage, the people of Tower Hamlets were concerned with something far more immediate: their daily lives. Tower Hamlets was already one of the most densely populated areas in London. Housing was scarce, traffic clogged the streets, and public services struggled to keep up with demand. To residents, the embassy threatened to make all of these problems worse. Imagine, they argued, the disruption caused by permanent police patrols, frequent protests, and heightened security checks. Imagine the roads closed during visits by high-ranking officials, the clashes between demonstrators, the cameras, and the fences. Local voices began to rise, demanding to know why their neighborhood had to bear the burden of a global power struggle. Community. Leaders argued that the Royal Mint site could be used for something far more beneficial to Londoners. Affordable. Housing, community centers, or green spaces projects that would improve daily life rather than complicate it. For them, the embassy represented not a bridge between nations, but a wall between the community and its needs. While local frustration grew louder, inside government offices, the debate became more complex. Confidential intelligence reports circulated in Whitehall, warning of the potential risks associated with the embassy's location, though the details were classified. Insiders hinted that the assessments emphasized vulnerabilities that could be exploited by a foreign power with the resources and determination of China. This intelligence forced the government into a difficult balancing act. On one hand, rejecting the embassy outright risked a diplomatic backlash. China was not just a foreign power, it was a global economic partner. Trade with Beijing mattered. Investment from China touched British infrastructure, education, and business. An outright rejection could provoke retaliation, perhaps in the form of restrictions on British companies operating in China, or a cooling of diplomatic channels at a time when international cooperation was needed on issues from climate change to global health. On the other hand, approving the project carried risks to national security, sovereignty, and political stability. It was a dilemma with no easy solution. In Parliament, the issue turned into a flashpoint. MPs pressed ministers to clarify their stance. Was Britain willing to compromise its security for economic convenience? Or was it prepared to draw a red line and risk angering one of the world's most powerful nations, the official government? Response was careful, almost evasive. The embassy plans were being reviewed in line with national security considerations. Behind those words, however, were heated debates, disagreements, and anxieties. For Beijing, the delays and doubts were unacceptable. Chinese officials insisted that the embassy was a necessity, not a weapon. The current embassy in Portland's place, they argued, was outdated, cramped, and unable to meet the rising demand for consular services such as visas. The new complex was presented as a solution to these practical problems. Espionage allegations, they claimed, were unfounded, politically motivated, and a reflection of rising anti-China sentiment within British politics. To underscore their frustration, Chinese representatives warned that obstructing the project could harm bilateral relations. For Beijing, the embassy was more than just a building. It was a test of respect. It was a statement of recognition. The British press seized on the story, and the public became more engaged. Investigative reports revealed details of the planned construction, multiple underground levels, reinforced structures, and advanced communication facilities. While such features were not unusual for embassies, they added fuel to the fire. Experts in cybersecurity explained to journalists how secure data centers and encrypted networks could serve dual purposes, facilitating diplomatic communication on one hand and enabling surveillance or hacking on the other. For a wary public, these explanations only deepened suspicion. Then, as if the controversy was not already complex enough, another layer appeared. The United States, Britain's closest ally, quietly entered the discussion. Washington, locked in its own strategic confrontation with Beijing, had long warned allies about the risks of Chinese influence. Intelligence officials from across the Atlantic reportedly urged London to adopt a hard line. To American policymakers, the proposed embassy was not just a British issue. It was part of the global chessboard where democracies and authoritarian powers were vying for influence, The effect of this pressure was subtle but powerful. Britain's decision-making process was no longer about a planning application, it was about aligning with allies, sending signals, and defending national interests. On a global scale, by the height of the debate, the embassy plan had become something much larger than anyone expected. What began as an architectural project had transformed into a question of sovereignty, trust, and identity. Local councils and Tower Hamlets eventually rejected the planning application, citing security risks and community impact. For residents, it was a victory. For the government, it was a relief, though a temporary one. For Beijing, it was a humiliation. The Royal Mint site remained untouched, its future uncertain. But the story had already left its mark. It hardened British skepticism toward China's infrastructure projects. It inspired local activism and community solidarity. It reminded the world that in modern geopolitics, even a piece of land can become a front line, because this was never just about a building. It was about power, about perception, and about the quiet yet fierce battles fought in the shadows of diplomacy. It was about how an embassy, designed to foster dialogue, could instead symbolize mistrust. And it was about how two powerful nations, one seeking recognition, the other seeking security, could turn a redevelopment project into a clash of civilizations. As the dust settled on part one of this story, one thing was clear. The fight over the new Chinese embassy in London had only just begun. The rejection of the initial application was not the end. Appeals could be made, negotiations could reopen, and compromises might still be sought. But the deep currents of suspicion, rivalry, and pride meant that whatever happened next, it would not be simple. For the people of Tower Hamlets, the storm had brought the world's geopolitics to their doorstep. For Britain, it had forced a confrontation between economic interests and national security. And for China, it had raised the question, how far could its global ambitions push before the world pushed back? This was not just a planning dispute. This was the story of power, espionage, and the fragile trust that shapes our modern world. And it was only the beginning. The rejection of the proposed Chinese embassy in Tower Hamlets was celebrated by many in Britain as a victory for vigilance and community action. But behind the cheers and headlines, the story was far from over. For China, the refusal was not a local planning issue. It was a direct challenge to its global ambitions, a public rebuke in a capital city that Beijing had long considered crucial to its European presence. And for the United Kingdom, the rejection solved nothing. It only postponed the difficult questions of how to engage with or resist the rising power of China. China's first reaction was measured but firm. Official statements from Beijing criticized the decision as politically motivated and evidence of rising hostility toward China in the West. The embassy project, they insisted, was never about espionage or politics. It was about practicality and necessity. The existing building in Portland Place was too small, too outdated, and unable to serve the growing needs of the Chinese community in Britain. Yet beneath these words, there was a sharper edge. Chinese diplomats warned that the decision risked damaging relations, casting doubt on Britain's sincerity as a partner, and feeding what they called anti-China sentiment. For observers, it was clear that the embassy dispute had become a test of wills. China had invested heavily in its global network of embassies, each designed not only as a place of diplomacy, but as a projection of power. From Africa to South America, new Chinese embassies had been constructed on grand scales, often dwarfing those of other nations. The London project was meant to be a crown jewel in this strategy, Europe's largest, a visible sign that China had arrived as a permanent, undeniable presence. To have this vision blocked was not just inconvenient, it was humiliating. Beijing now faced a dilemma of its own. To push too hard might deepen tensions and risk further rejection. To back away quietly would send the wrong signal not only to Britain, but to the world. In China's political culture, respect and face are central. Losing face in such a high-profile way was unacceptable. And so, behind the scenes, strategies began to take shape. Diplomatic channels remained open. Chinese officials hinted at the possibility of redesigning the project, adjusting its scale, or relocating it to a less sensitive area. At the same time, more subtle pressure was applied. Economic ties were quietly emphasized. Britain's reliance on Chinese trade, investment, and students was not insignificant. Would the UK risk all of this over a patch of land? This was the question Beijing wanted policymakers in London to ask themselves. In Whitehall, the pressure was felt. The rejection by Tower Hamlets Council was a local decision. But everyone knew the final word would not rest with local authorities alone. The British government would ultimately have to engage with China directly, either to explain, to negotiate, or to resist. And within the government, opinions remained divided. Some ministers argued that Britain needed to find a compromise. The embassy could perhaps be built with conditions or restrictions on design, oversight of communications infrastructure, or agreements about how the site would be used. Others were far less optimistic. They believed no condition could prevent the risks. To allow China such a strong foothold in the heart of London was to invite trouble. The debate mirrored Britain's broader dilemma with China: how to balance economic engagement with national security. For decades, Western nations had believed that trade and integration would moderate Beijing's behavior. Yet, as China grew wealthier, it also grew more assertive, more authoritarian, and more ambitious. The embassy dispute became a microcosm of this reality. Could Britain maintain ties without sacrificing its own safety? Or had the relationship already deteriorated to the point where mistrust defined everything? Meanwhile, the United States continued to play its role from the shadows. American intelligence officials had long been wary of Chinese diplomatic facilities, seeing them as Dulu's compounds, diplomatic on the outside, intelligence hubs on the inside. Washington quietly encouraged London to remain firm, even celebrating the local rejection as a small but symbolic victory. For the United States, the embassy dispute in London was not just about Britain. It was about setting a precedent for how democracies should handle China's global expansion. But for the people of Tower Hamlets, the issue remained close to home. Activists, community leaders, and residents continued to voice concerns that any resurrection of the embassy plan would once again place their borough under the shadow of global rivalry. They had tasted the chaos of protests during earlier Chinese state visits. They had seen how entire neighborhoods could be disrupted when world leaders arrived under heavy police protection. For them, the debate was not abstract. It was about schools, housing, traffic, and the right to live without being caught in the crossfire of superpowers. Journalists, too, kept digging. Investigations revealed that embassies worldwide often contain highly secure underground chambers, sometimes referred to as vaults. These vaults house servers, communication equipment, and encrypted systems. For China, whose cyber capabilities were already under international scrutiny, the presence of such facilities in London raised alarm bells. Could the Royal Mint site have become a nerve center for digital surveillance, capable of targeting Britain's financial sector, political institutions, and even its allies? To many experts, the answer was yes. The controversy also triggered broader questions. What should be the role of foreign embassies in modern times? Were they still places of cultural exchange and diplomacy, or had they evolved into something more sinister, fortresses of information? Islands of sovereignty where host nations had little oversight. The Chinese embassy plan in London forced people to confront these uncomfortable realities. As the weeks turned into months, the atmosphere grew heavier. Chinese officials expressed their dissatisfaction more openly. British politicians faced mounting pressure from both security experts and business lobbies. Local residents demanded clarity, and in the background, the ghost of the Cold War seemed to return. The old battles of spies and listening devices had given way to cyber wars and surveillance networks. But the essence was the same: mistrust, suspicion, and the endless struggle for advantage. By late summer, the fate of the Royal Mint site remained unresolved. China had the option to appeal, but any appeal would likely reignite the same arguments and the same resistance. Some analysts suggested that Beijing might choose to wait, calculating that political winds in Britain could shift with time. Others believed that China might escalate, perhaps reducing cooperation in trade talks, perhaps slowing visas for British officials, perhaps finding other subtle ways to demonstrate its displeasure. For Britain, this was a test of resilience. Could it withstand pressure from a superpower? Could it protect its security without isolating itself diplomatically? Could it balance the demands of allies like the United States with its own need for independence? These were not easy questions, and the embassy dispute offered no easy answers. But one thing was already certain: the controversy had left scars. It had hardened skepticism toward China within the British public. It had energized local activism. It had drawn clear lines between those who saw China as a partner and those who saw it as a threat. And it had reminded the world that even something as ordinary as a building could become the front line of geopolitics. The larger meaning of the story was clear. The embassy that never was had nevertheless shaken London. It had forced a city, a government, and a nation to confront the realities of a changing world order. In this order, great powers no longer clash only in battlefields. They clash in boardrooms, in cyberspace, in city planning councils, and in the hearts of communities. A patch of land in Tower Hamlets became a microcosm of the global struggler. Struggle between security and openness, between power and trust, between national interests and international cooperation. For China, the saga became a lesson in limits. Ambition, no matter how grand, cannot always overcome suspicion. For Britain, it was a lesson in vigilance that sovereignty must be guarded, not just at borders, but within city walls. And for the rest of the world, it was a reminder that the battles shaping our future may not look like the wars of the past. They may unfold quietly in planning applications, in debates about construction, in the designs of buildings whose walls may never reveal their true purpose. The embassy that shook London was never built, but its story will echo for years to come because it was never really about the building. It was about power, mistrust, and the fragile balance that holds the modern world together.